In this presentation, we're going to learn about narrative analysis, macrostructure and microstructure, as well as the pragmatic level. And this is what you're going to use for the Jackie story and the Goodnight Linnea story, which there's an assignment under the assignments tab. And this assignment is going to help you to learn how to analyze the language that children use in stories. There are going to be different levels of analysis that are going to be explained. One is the macrostructure, or sort of the big structure, the grammar of the stories. Think about something beyond, but kind of encompassing beginning, middle, and end. And then there's another level that also includes other types of sentences that are produced and determining whether they're complex or not, if there are clauses, if kind of the types of words that children use. And then there are going to be two samples that are provided for you to apply what you have been exposed to. So before we get to actually talk about the analysis, it's important that we know that stories can be gathered in different ways. I kind of alluded to this in class the other day. First, you can have the child make up a story, which is imaginative, or self-created. That's an example of what the Jackie story is going to be like, that you're going to be listening to. You can use dolls, you can use bears, you can have them stage play routines, then you can have them tell you about it. You can also give them a picture and have them make a story about the picture, not describe, make a story out of the picture. Or you can use a wordless picture book to have the child generate a story with as much detail as possible. Kind of think about what's involved in each of those examples that I just provided you, and think about which one involves the most cognitive load and which one involves the least cognitive load. So which one is taxing the system of memory and attention and retrieval more, and which one is doing that to the system the least. Because there's differences amongst those, right? So when we think about story generation, which is the development of a story as you go, that one is going to tax the system more. But if you have a story in which you have a book and you're kind of narrating the events of a book, then that kind of taxes the system less, because then there's visual supports there supporting. You could also tell them to tell you about a time in which they went to a birthday party, to the beach, to the playground, to Disney, or whichever the topic of conversation that would be appropriate culturally, that would elicit some discourse from the child. And then a bit easier than generating a story is actually retelling a story that is familiar to them. Maybe you show them a video cartoon, or you have them tell you about a book that they have heard or read before. You could read The Three Bears or some other common story and then have them retell you what the story is about. That's a retelling, okay? So keeping in mind that also within all those two mediums, the retell or the story generation, you could be providing a lot of structure, you could be providing no structure at all. I give you a link there for an example of one of the wordless video cartoons that you can use. Shaun the Sheep or Pingu are good for that purpose. In terms of what then you can look for in stories, there's multiple levels that you can analyze. At the greatest level, and I know I kind of flip these based on the title of the presentation, is the pragmatics, or the social use of the discourse itself. Then, you can also look at the macrostructure of the organization, and that involves also looking at, are all the events kind of provided in a sequence, and is there a character, is there a setting? And then you can also look deeper, kind of like taking a zoom lens and zooming into the microstructure, the types of sentences that are produced, the types of words, whether they're complex or not, okay? So starting with the pragmatics level, which is the biggest level, right? You can ask yourself questions like, is the child aware of the audience? Does he or she provide sufficient information to the listener to make it understood what he is meaning or what he wants to retell? Does the child seem to understand the purpose of what he or she is retelling? Does the child know that when you tell a story, you are entertaining, for example? Does the child use pauses, intonation, and other tools to sort of denote a separation between his or her mind with the minds of the characters? So like, is there dialogue that is quoted. And then the mouse said, and then there's a kind of a pause and an introduction, because there's no quotation marks in real life, right? As you're talking, you can't mark them. And then is there any emotion mentioned regarding what the characters are feeling, thinking, experiencing in the story? At the macrostructure level, we would ask, does it look complete? Does the narrative have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Are the events temporally, like are they related to each other in terms of time or chronologically related? Are they sequential? Are the actions and consequences clearly tied? Is there a problem and then is there a solution, sort of thing, okay? And then there's more in the next slide. In terms of macrostructures, I mentioned before, this is a level of analysis that actually is documented in the literature from the 1970s, 1980s onward. And it's basically this concept that within the stories, there's a grammar, there's a structure, right? So, and that structure involves two main big components. One is a setting and the other one is an episode. And that episode involves an initiating event, which is going to motivate both an internal response by the characters, like a feeling, a thought, and a plan, as well as an attempt, an action to solve whatever that initiating event was. And then as a result of that attempt or action, there's going to be a consequence, which hopefully results in a resolution, also a reaction at the emotive level and an ending. So keep in mind that this is, kind of like what basic stories are supposed to look like, but that not every culture out there will provide all the different little intricacies or the little steps in the process. I really like this way to represent what would be the entire episode that I mentioned before. And it involves the manipulatives of of what's called Brady, the story grammar marker. And it's also a way to teach children, but also is a medium by which teachers and our SLPs can guide themselves in ensuring that all the different components are targeted. It's important to know that not all of the stories that children produce are going to include all these components, as I said before. And that over time, the assumption is just like kids get better, adults get better, right? At producing the structure, form, or the form and the content of language across different functions, that they would be able to become more sophisticated in their introduction and or inclusion of all of these components of stories too. So the ones that you see here are the different stages of development, and there's plus and minuses of looking at stages. The pluses is kind of nice to look for a way to place a child, or to have an idea for a landmark of skills. The negative is sometimes kids produce stories that are actually between two of these particular stages, and that would be the case for no matter what stage theory you're looking at. But you would look at the top three, descriptive sequence, action sequence, and reactive sequence, as the three most common ones during the age period that you are currently looking at. And you see that that's kind of based on Jerome Bruner's landscape of action perspective, with this idea that really it takes all the way to early elementary school and really late elementary school, I would say age 9, for children to be able to really tune into the characters' thoughts and feelings. It takes a while for kids to realize that their world is not the only world out there. So they will initially focus on particularly talking about landscape of action type relationships, with events that are happening and then what the character is doing in those events. So, kind of be thinking about this as you listen to the Jackie story, but also note if there's any instances in which those landscape of action, consciousness verbs tend to appear, those mental state verbs as they're called, tend to appear in those two stories that you're going to listen to. And what's nice about this is from the same company that actually developed the Brady story grammar marker, manipulative. They also developed these fill in the blank organizers. And so the nice thing about it is it's provided here for you to utilize for when you do the analysis for Jackie as well as Linnea. So we've talked a lot about macro structure, which is like the big, like I said, structure of the story. But what about when you look beyond? I mean, you can have a story that has the beginning, a middle, and an end, but maybe it only has 3 sentences. Okay, so in looking at the utterances that the child has produced after you have transcribed, are there words, sentences, and phrases? How many of each are there in the sample? Look over the sentences that you transcribed. Are there complete sentences? Do they have subjects and verbs and objects? Are they simple, that they only have one subject, or complex, that they have more than one subject and are coordinated with an and or a but? Is there complex syntax being used? Are there clauses that are coordinated or embedded? For example, Max, the mouse that was hungry, went to the store. That was hungry is information that's additional about that mouse that's embedded within that. Are there noun phrases? Does the child produce any kind of elaborated phrase in which he may say the big brown truck, instead of just saying the truck? How is the vocabulary? Does the vocabulary seem complex or specialized, or just simple and high frequency in nature? And these of course are just to guide you. I know that you're still learning what these things may be. They're actually indicators out there for how we categorize words into complex and specialized, but we're not going into in this class. But at least exposing you to the idea that you can look at the form of language and the content of language from a manipulative, from a perspective in which that those are variables that can be manipulated or counted or objectified, which is important from a metalinguistic perspective. So we get to the point of discussing what your first assignment is, and this is part 1. And I told you what you needed to do. You need to listen to the Jackie story, which now is also uploaded in a way that I think will be accessible via different types of computer machines. And about that Jackie story, bring to class next Tuesday your transcription and kind of think about what can we say about that story at a pragmatic level. What can we say about what episodes, components you found? So use those slides 8 and 10 to help you. And then also tell me what level of development you think the Jackie story is at. So looking at the developmental stages organizer, kind of find out where you think that story is. And then I want you to look over the next few slides that actually have a story that was composed, which I'm not going to narrate, so you can view it yourself, read through it. The difference between this story and the Jackie story is the Jackie story was, verbally told. This story was written, but part of the story, there was also dictation involved. So the child actually dictated what the child wanted to say. Kind of compare those slides that have when the child wrote herself, and you can tell, versus when the child was dictating, because the text is longer. So why would that be longer when the child is dictating? Kind of thinking about what the cognitive load is. Remember how we talked about that in the first few slides. Okay, so as I said, I want you to listen to the Jackie story and follow those directions, and then look over this story, which is included here in print, right? In this case, my daughter illustrated it, or used illustrations to support the text, and also she used dictation. She told me what she wanted to say, and I wrote it down. So I want you to know whether there are differences in structure between the two stories, differences at the pragmatic level, differences in the microstructure, right? So that then you can answer them in answer the questions in slide number 20. Okay. So about the linear story, I want you to answer, what can we say about the story at a pragmatic level? What are the episode components that you find? Again, you can go back to using slides 8 and 10. And then what is the child's level of narrative development using that developmental checklist in slide number 9? Okay, so have those two, the Jackie one and the linear one, finished by the time you come to class on Tuesday, and then we'll discuss the part 2 and we'll do it together. Okay, so on Tuesday when we meet, you're going to be comparing and contrasting, right? So that's why I have you do part 1 before we meet. So in part 2, you'll say how the two stories are similar and different. Which of the two seem more complete and why? Which has more complex sentences and clauses, and which of the two stories seems to have more sophisticated vocabulary. Which one seemed to be easier to understand, for a naive listener? Which one is more cohesive, like flows better and also makes more sense? And then I want you to kind of think critically about the process, the scaffolding that was provided. So what do you think about the role of dictation during narrative retellings with specific children? And what did you observe was different when the dictation was involved versus when it wasn't? Okay, because that helps us kind of think about the role of cognition in the formulation of language.